Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Mr. Fortune's Trials by H.C. Bailey. Trial 3. The Only Son. First published London Magazine, November 1924. Reggie Fortune had spent a long day in Mr. Justice Sparrow's court. You remember the case of the wrong false teeth. Counsel and judge had been inexhaustibly facetious. Reggie Fortune was weary of the sound of the human voice. He sought tea at that one of his clubs where everybody is learned or important. The muffins there are good. In that cushioned mausoleum you see him recovering his respect for human nature. But even there brave men talk. Behold a venerable reflow of the Royal Society, who is believed to know more than anyone else of the way in which your breakfast becomes your brain power, lecturing him on the first principles of the art of the movies. This distressed Mr. Fortune. He objects to other people going outside their subjects. Reggie Fortune ordered another muffin, and in the diversion got hold of an evening paper. Professor Jubal continued to explain how to compose a film which would give Miss Mary Pickford a real chance. It was necessary to do something violent. Mr. Fortune began to read the paper aloud. Gallant Channel Rescue. I say, this is a good story. On the late arrival of the Calais boat at Dover this morning, it transpired that the delay had been caused by an exciting adventure. Soon after leaving Calais harbour, when the boat met rough water, one of the passengers, Mr. Wilfrid Harford, fell overboard. His companion, Mr. Ingram Langton, the well-known scientist, immediately plunged in fully dressed to rescue him. The steamer was going at full speed, and a heavy sea was running, but Mr. Langton swam to his friend's side and supported him till a boat could reach them. Mr. Harford was brought on board in an exhausted condition but is now recovering. Good work, what? Reggie smiled. Ingram Langton. That's the biochemist, I suppose. Let me see. Professor Jubal frowned and sniffed. Yes, Langton's always been good at getting his name in the papers, but if he ever risked his life for anybody, I'll eat my hat. He proceeded to give a character of Ingram Langton. A clever fellow, of course. Rather remarkable he should have done so well working alone in that private laboratory of his, but a poor creature, quite without the scientific spirit, mixed up with business, kept his work secret till he could make a splash, used other men's results and gave them no credit. Mr. Fortune listened, smiling. Professor Jubal had been diverted to a subject about which he knew something, if not everything, for Reggie did not suppose that he was quite accurate about Ingram Langton. It was Reggie's experience that men of science do not always love one another, but the contrasts between the mean fellow described by the professor and the noble hero of the newspaper had a certain interest. That was how Mr. Fortune came into the case, but he did not know it then. Unconscious of his doom, the little victim played. He spent a happy fortnight admiring his daffodils and pruning his roses, and thought of anything but Ingram Langton and Wilfrid Harford. They remained in one of the pigeonholes of his mind. It is the opinion of Superintendent Bell that Mr. Fortune sometimes forgives but never forgets. Then family affection called him back to town. He had to dine with his livelier sister, the one who married the bishop, and this was the next incident in the case of the only son. The dinner was edible, the conversation mildly improving, and the port sound. Mr. Fortune found comfort in the last, and the old clergyman next him, when the ladies were gone, also approved of it. They smiled at each other. The bishop was gently laying down the law upon confession. A theological argument developed. Reggie sighed and filled his neighbour's glass. The old clergyman listened to the bishop for a little while, then sipped his wine and turned to Reggie. An odd thing happened in my church last week. It's quite out of the world, you know. I found a young man in it, a stranger to me. He seemed very uncomfortable, sat down, wandered about, sat down again, and I fancied he was watching me. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him. I thought perhaps he wanted to learn something about the church. "It's a very beautiful old building, Mr. Fortune." He looked at me in a curious, bewildered way and didn't answer. I talked a little about the church. He didn't seem to listen. Then he interrupted me to ask if I was the clergyman there. I said yes, of course. Did he want to speak to me as a clergyman? Then he said, "Did people confess to me?" I told him I didn't hear confessions, but he seemed so distressed. I asked him if I could help him in any way. Was there something he wanted to say to a priest? He stared at me very strangely and cried out, "I don't know. I don't know what I want to confess," and he rushed out of the church. The old man sipped his port. That seemed to me very odd, Mr. Fortune. A man who wants to confess and doesn't know what he wants to confess must be quite uncommon. "I wonder," Reggie Fortune murmured. "What did he look like?" I really didn't notice. He was quite a lad, very thin. I thought him nervous. He flushed and trembled as he spoke to me. "Yes. Did you see his eyes?" "I don't think I did. Now you mention it, I remember he was continually closing his eyes. The lids kept on dropping, as it were. Yet he didn't seem at all sleepy." Reggie put down his cigar. "No, I don't think he was sleepy," he said slowly. "You've never seen him again?" "I wish you'd let me know if you do." That was the second incident in the case. It did not then occur to Mr. Fortune to connect it with the first, but it worried him, and when a week had gone by without any message from the old clergyman, Mr. Fortune went down to his parish. A church and 3 old houses lurked together in forest, a scrap of the forest which once covered all the country between the chalk of the North Downs and the South Downs. Some of the nobler trees are gone, and the tangles of birch scrub and bracken grow thicker, but it has changed little in 1,000 years. Though motor cars roar through it on a tarred road now, 100 yards from the road you can forget that men have ever meddled with it, and hear nothing uglier than a jay. Mr. Fortune saw the little shingled spire among the budding trees and found a lane that led to it. He went into the church. No lean young man with dropping eyelids was inside, but he lingered. It was a strange little church, dark in that spring noon, for the Saxon builders had pierced the massive walls with only a few tiny windows. The tower was built of wood, huge oak beams fretted by the centuries. Mr. Fortune, who loves all manner of craftsmanship, was deeply interested. "Yes, noble old place," he murmured. "But I fancy our young friend didn't come to look at woodwork. Why did he come?" In a corner lay an ancient chest, the trunk of an oak hollowed out and fitted with a lid. "You're a dream," said Mr. Fortune, and opened it in a pensive ecstasy. It contained cleaning rags. "My mistake." He wandered up the nave examining the changes which later men had made in the Saxon masonry. Fascinating. But I don't think he was fascinated. He didn't come to study church architecture. I suppose he really did want a parson. Oh, my aunt. He had come into the chancel. A brass in the floor bore a quaint picture of a man, and on it was inscribed something about Robertus Harford, armiger. Robert Harford, gentleman, had died piously in the 17th century. Harford. Reggie frowned at it. Now, what do I know about some fellow called Harford? Yes, he fell off the Dover packet, and Langton, the biochemist, fished him out, and Jubal said it was very improbable of Langton, but this is not relevant. He walked across to the rectory. The rector had gone to Chichester. Reggie sighed and got into his car and sought an inn. He found one all by itself at a crossroads in the forest. The landlord was harsh with him, but mellowed under the influence of his own ale. Few are the men, or women, who will not talk to Reggie Fortune. No, they didn't get many strangers coming there, not stopping. Running through on their motors, of course. Why would they stop? He hadn't heard of any new folks coming to live thereabouts. Nowhere for 'em to live. No houses in the forest. He had heard Mr. Langton over at Newlands had folks staying with him, a young gentleman and his mother, Harford by name. But they wouldn't be like strangers. Old Sussex folk, the Harfords. There was Mr. Geoffrey Harford over at Toldwins. Reggie changed the subject. That landlord remembers him as a pleasant gentleman, asking a lot about butterflies and knowing about beer, a kind of artist. Reggie left his car at the inn and went walking, an exercise he does not love. The house of Ingram Langston was marked on the ordnance map, 2 miles as the crow flies, Reggie groaned. And I don't fly. Jam for Reginald. He plodded on by wet tracks, and the sandstone was knobbly, and brambles and sprouting bracken caught at his ankles. It is borne in on me that I am a silly ass. That's the worst of having a conscience, he mourned. But he went on. The red chimneys of Langton's house were in sight when he heard someone coughing. It was a long paroxysm, and at the end of it came the murmur of a woman's voice, anxious and tender. Then a man spoke rather shrill. "Oh, don't fuss, Mother. I'm all right. I'm perfectly all right. I haven't been coughing for weeks." Reggie checked and waited for them. They were on a path which led down from the house beside a stream golden with kingcups. The man hurried on with quick, short steps, though he was tall. The woman caught him up and put her hand in his arm. He let it fall and drew aside. "Go on. There isn't room to walk together," he said sharply. He was a tall youth. A heavy coat did not conceal that he was very lean. The face which rose above his muffler was lean too and flushed. He panted a little. Reggie strode on. "I beg your pardon." He lifted his hat. "Could you tell me the way to the Wick Arms? I seem to have lost myself." The woman smiled. "It is confusing in the forest, isn't it?" She was a pretty creature, young to be the mother of a man, and her smile was merry, but her eyes did not smile. "Wick Arms, Will." She turned to her son. "Which is the best way?" He looked at Reggie and looked away again quickly, like a naughty child. "Coming away from it, aren't you?" he muttered, and pointed with his stick. Reggie made a little conversation about the paths, and the woman answered him amiably. But her son stood apart, slashing his stick at the bushes, and it was he whom Reggie watched. He could not keep still. At his best pace, Reggie Fortune trudged back to the inn, and as he went heard the lad coughing again. The round cherubic face of Mr. Fortune was troubled. His car took him to London at an unholy speed. Before he dined, he wrote a letter to Scotland Yard, read it over with a frown and stared at it, and muttered a quotation. "Subjoineth the Abbot Deodate. God help all poor souls lost in the dark." Some days later he sat gazing dreamily at the people and the tulips in the park. The chief of the Criminal Investigation Department tripped along, very youthful and sprightly, his hat on one side, his coat an epigram. In the midst of a dazzling smile for the debutante of the season, he saw Mr. Fortune. He extricated himself from his admirers and pointed his stick at that solemn, rosy countenance. "You're one of the world's workers, aren't you?" Mr. Fortune's eyebrows asked him an unspoken question. He nodded. Mr. Fortune rose and walked away with him. The rooms of the Honourable Sidney Lomas are hung with French prints of the 18th century. He goes with them well. They make Reggie Fortune look a little solid, a little respectable. Lomas perched on the cushioned fender. "Yes, I think we have it all, Reginald," he said. "But what the deuce do you want with it?" "I don't know," Reggie mumbled. "That's why I want it." "My dear fellow, there's quite enough crime in the world without inventing it. You needn't make work for us." "Yes, begin with the facts, do you mind? We'll deal with the jokes afterwards." Lomas shook his head. "Not your usual cheery self, Reginald. A little brusque with me, a little morose." "Well, the Harford family, that was your first question. The Harfords are old Sussex people. Big place near Lewes let to Isaacson, the tanner. The present head of the house is a young fellow of 20. His father and elder brother were both killed in the war. The boy's health is not good. Lung trouble. His mother took him to Switzerland after the war, and they lived there some time. They came back this spring. It is said he isn't much better." "Why did they come back?" "In Switzerland, they met an English doctor, Ingram Langton. Not so much a physician as a man of science, I understand. He isn't in practice. He does research work. Quite a good reputation." Yes, he has a bit of a name. Biochemistry is his line. Langton and Mrs. Harford became friendly. She tells her friends that he was very kind and helpful with Wilfred. She was anxious about the boy and asked Langton to look at him. Langton said the Swiss doctors were doing no good, but he thought he could. He offered to take the boy in his house in Sussex and treat him. So the Harfords came back to England with Langton, and they've been living with him. Yes. Why does a biochemist undertake to treat a boy with lung trouble? Isn't it done? Lomas shrugged. The man is a doctor. I don't understand the divisions of the profession. It's not usual. Like finding a cook doing parlour-maid. Lomas smiled. I should suspect the cook of being devoted to her master, Reginald. It had crossed my innocent mind that Langton liked Mrs. Harford. Not a criminal offence. No, she's a comely woman. What do you know about Mrs. Harford? She was a beauty in her time and an heiress. Brought a lot of money with her. Blameless wife and mother. Rather shattered when her husband and the elder boy were killed. Devoted herself to the boy Wilfred. Nobody has a word to say against her. And what happens to the Harford property if Wilfred dies? If Wilfred died without making a will, it would go to his mother, I suppose. She's next of kin, and there's no entail. Lomas frowned. You're taking it rather far, Fortune. Yes, I think someone is looking rather far ahead. Good heavens, do you mean she is planning her son's death? Why should she? The Harford property's respectable, but she's a wealthy woman, with her own money settled on her. You're too ingenious, Reginald. Not me, said Mr. Fortune sadly. There's plenty of brainwork in this case, but not by the police force. Lomas, old thing. Are there any more Harfords in the world? The war wiped them out. Only an old bachelor, Geoffrey Harford, some sort of cousin. He was out in India for years. Lives in Sussex now, Tunbridge Wells way. I know where he lives. Next door to Langton. And he's next of kin, is he? And it's all very odd and disturbing. What have you got in your head? You don't imagine this old fellow has arranged with Langton to get the Harfords down there and murder them? No, I don't imagine things. I have no imagination, Lomas. But I'm uncomfortable. Well, what's worrying you? Reggie sighed and lay back and blew smoke rings. Langton saved this boy's life. That worries me. He told the story of the Channel boat and gazed at Lomas with large, melancholy eyes. What's the matter with that? Lomas cried. If Langton jumped into a rough sea to fish him out, Langton isn't exactly trying to murder him. Don't you believe the story? I verified it. It's quite true. That's what bothers me. Langton didn't want Wilfred to die then, but a few weeks later, Wilfred was found in a church near Langton's house. Nerves all wrong, striking symptoms of drugs, trying to confess to a parson. And he didn't know what he wanted to confess. Good heavens! Yes. What's happening to Wilfred in Langton's house? I went down the other day. I saw Wilfred and Mamma. Wilfred wasn't loving her. Wilfred's on edge. Also, Wilfred's in poor health, asthmatic cough. But the drug symptoms were not marked. He could keep his eyes open. Lomas stared. What drug makes a fellow shut his eyes? For the first time, Reggie smiled. Lomas, dear, you don't need it. Gelsomine would do the trick. He might have been given Gelsomine for his cough, but he oughtn't to have enough to make him lose control of his eyelids. And if he did, it would break him all up, and he is broken. But what does it all come to? Lomas protested. You say the stuff would be good for his cough. Well, Langton prescribes it, finds the dose too big and cuts it off. You say yourself the symptoms had stopped, all quite reasonable. Yes. And what did Wilfred want to confess that he couldn't get out? The boy was dazed with drugs. Yes. Mr. Ingram Langton, who is a bit of a blood as a chemist, takes a boy with lung trouble into his house and pours into him drugs that affect the nerve centres till he don't know where he is. Oh, quite reasonable, Lomas. But Langton saved his life. He can't mean the boy any harm. He saved Wilfred's life a month ago. He may want to murder him today. I don't see my way, Lomas protested. The rational explanation of your facts is that Langton took up the boy's case out of affection for the mother and hasn't handled it well. I suppose he's more of a chemist than a doctor. Very likely he has too good an opinion of himself. These experts always think they know everything. He cocked a sarcastic eye at Mr. Fortune. Very deplorable, Reginald, but not criminal. My innocent boy, said Reggie, never believe anybody's murdering till you have the corpse. Never see anything till it's over. Then you'll be the perfect policeman. And what the deuce do you see? Possibility number 1, Mrs. Harford wants Wilfred killed, and Langton's doing it. Then she'll have the estate. Possibility number 2, Langton wants Wilfred killed so he can marry Mrs. Harford and the estate. Possibility number 3, Geoffrey Harford wants Wilfred and Mrs. Harford killed so he can take the lot, and Langton's arranging it. And you say you've no imagination? Lomas laughed. Good heaven, Fortune, you don't believe any of that, do you? No. I've an open mind. Lots of other possibilities, Lomas, old thing. But one thing's certain, that boy's going to the devil. He started up. Can't you feel it? The whole business is wicked. There's something malign behind all we know. Lomas was impressed at last. We have nothing to take hold of, he complained. What can you do? I can save that boy if I have time. He bit his lip. I want Bell, Lomas. We'll go down and reconnoitre Mr. Langton. I want to deal with this little murder before it's done. Quite a new experiment for the department. For some days afterwards, an artist was sketching in the forest near the house of Ingram Langton. The trees were in a delectable variety of colour. Birch and beech lucent green, oaks breaking into yellow and crimson and orange, ash sombre still as the dark firs, and the ground beneath was flooded with the blue of hyacinths. The artist made many sketches in many places, till there came an evening when he was joined by a sturdy man who carried the vasculum of the botanist. I've got onto it now, Mr. Fortune, said the botanist. Been making love to the maids, Bell? It was the gardener, said Superintendent Bell. I like men better than women in business. The old fellow we saw was Geoffrey Harford, sir. He often comes over to Langton's place. Langton don't go to him much. Langton's looking after his patient, of course. Very proper. Geoffrey Harford's coming to dine again tonight. They're cutting the first asparagus for him. Reggie gasped. Reggie packed up his paint-box. The blighter, he said pensively. And what does the gardener think of things? He's not the kind of man that thinks much, sir. He says it's a lonely place and Mr. Langton's a funny gentleman. Yes, I thought that too, Reggie murmured. Langton's been here some years. Geoffrey Harford got the house for him. He had a laboratory built on. Very seldom had anybody to stay with him till Mrs. Harford and her son came. By the way, she's gone, sir. I know, and that leaves Wilfred here alone. But he's still alive. I saw him. Seemed quite happy in his mind. Even affable. He talked to the wandering artist, said he liked the place, liked being here when he wasn't bothered. Now when I saw him with his mother, he wasn't liking the place. He wasn't liking anything. That means when his mother is here, he is bothered. When she was with him, he wasn't drugged. Today he was. His eyelids were flapping like wings. What do you make of that, Bell? They only drug him when she isn't here, Bell said. Why, sir? I suppose they're afraid she'll notice it. I wonder, Mr. Fortune murmured. They strode on through the forest on a track between impenetrable walls of green, till on the crest of a rise they came to a clearing and saw, far away beyond bright meadows and tilth and copse, the long mass of the downs. In another moment they were shut in again by trees. Not a good country, Mr. Fortune shuddered. Not a kind country, it don't let you see. They came to their inn, and Superintendent Bell, amazed and gratified, heard Mr. Fortune order a high tea. I enjoy this sort of meal, sir, said he at his third egg. I thought you didn't care for it. I don't, said Reggie gloomily. This isn't a meal, it's nourishment. And fellows like G. Harford go out to dinner, and have the first asparagus. A wicked world, Bell. Come on, let's hear him eat. They mounted a little two-seater, and through the gloaming made for Langton's house again. The car was run into the forest some way off and stopped. They stole up to the house. Little shafts of light between the curtains showed the dining-room window. For some time they heard nothing but a murmur of voices and service. An owl was screeching in the forest. They strained their ears in vain. Then Wilfrid Harford grew louder. He was talking of what he would do when he had his own way. The others seemed to be laughing at him. He protested that he was not tied to his mother's apron strings. He became louder and wilder. He lost his head and seemed to know that he had lost it. Then one of the quieter voices was raised, and with authority. The noisy lad was being removed. Lights came in another room. The men outside felt their way along the wall. Wilfrid was still noisy. He seemed to be quarrelling with his companions, but the quieter voice was dominating him. Reggie could only make out a word here and there, but it was repeating something again and again. The boy fell silent, but the quiet voice went on. It talked of your mother. It talked of friends and free. Reggie slid along to the front door, tapped on it, and stood listening intently in the silence that followed. For it was utter silence. The quiet voice had stopped. After a moment there came to the door a man in a dinner jacket, a large and hurried man. "What the devil do you want?" he said. Reggie, in a strong Cockney accent and rather intoxicated, was devilishly sorry to bother him, but he had lost the jolly old Brighton Road. Which was the perishing way to the Brighton Road? The large man snapped out directions and slammed the door. Reggie took Bell's arm and lurched away till they turned the hedge out of sight of the house. Then he strode on fast. "That was Langton," Bell said. "Yes. So the voice before wasn't Langton's voice, therefore it was Geoffrey Harford's. That little quiet voice? Funny sound. Seemed to be saying the same thing over and over again." "I know," Reggie said irritably. "Come on, man." "Finish with it, sir. What the devil can we do?" Reggie growled. "Come on. Where's that damned car?" Superintendent Bell was surprised and pained. It is not Mr. Fortune's habit to swear. The lamps were lit. The engine started. The car backed out to the road. But Mr. Fortune did not drive away. He sat bent over the wheel, looking ahead. The lamplight dove through the dark to where the forest overhung the road in a sandstone cliff, and above the little caves of gloom-gnarled beech roots twisted up into the night. Superintendent Bell stirred. "Looks pretty ghastly, that," he said. "Kind of wicked." "Ghastly?" Reggie Fortune laughed. "Ghastly it is, Bell, and I'm leaving him to it. God help me." Just above them, in a sudden rush of music, a nightingale began to sing. Reggie let the car go, and Superintendent Bell held fast and prepared to die. Even in daylight, Reggie Fortune's driving terrifies. It was another car, Mr. Fortune's own sedate saloon, which brought him and Bell next day to the London hotel where Mrs. Harford was staying. It was not a vagabond artist, but a man punctiliously correct, and in spite of his round face, grave and melancholy, whom Mrs. Harford received with visible alarm. "I have to apologize for what seems an intrusion, madame. I believe that it may be of service to you. I am sure it is necessary," said Mr. Fortune, slowly picking his words. "You have my name. I am a medical man and the advisor in medical matters of the Criminal Investigation Department." He paused and studied her. She was much agitated. "Circumstances have drawn my attention to the condition of your son, Mr. Wilfrid Harford. But I remember you. Don't I remember you? You spoke to us in the wood." "I did. I saw your son then. I have seen him since. I am certain that it is your duty to remove him from Mr. Langton's house." She wrung her hands. "Oh, I was afraid," she gasped. "What are you afraid of?" said Reggie sharply. Her eyes opened very wide. "Why, I was afraid you'd say that." But he seemed so much better at first. Mr. Langton was so kind, and he really understood Wilfrid. And Wilfrid really was better. Mr. Langton made him better at first. Yes. What has Mr. Langton made of him now? But I don't know. Her hands still worked together. "Wilfrid says he's perfectly well when I'm not there. He says it's only that I worry him," she cried. That's why I came away. It is really." "And when you are there," Reggie insisted coldly. "Oh, he seems so ill. And he's not like himself. Mr. Langton says it's just the treatment, and I mustn't worry. He says Wilfrid can come to see me sometimes in town. But I've asked him and Bea won't come. Mr. Langton says he hopes to persuade him soon." "And you do everything Mr. Langton tells you?" Reggie frowned. "What can I do?" she sobbed. "Wilfrid won't listen to me now. It's terrible. He doesn't want me to be with him. He doesn't like me anymore. I have a car here, Mrs. Harford. I will drive you down to Mr. Langton's house. You must see Wilfrid alone and tell him that you want him to come away with you. If there is any difficulty, I will speak to Mr. Langton." "You? Do you know him?" "Yes, I think I know him," said Reggie Fortune. She wrung her hands. "Oh, I should be so glad if I could get him away. But last time I saw him, his cough was so bad again, and Mr. Langton says that to interrupt the treatment would be dangerous." "It is much more dangerous to go on with it," said Reggie. "That treatment of Mr. Langton's is destroying your son." "Destroying?" she gasped. "That is the word," said Reggie gravely. "Come." She looked at him a moment and ran out. Reggie's chauffeur drove that car. Superintendent Bell sat by him, and Reggie was behind with Mrs. Harford. She did not talk. She lay back watching the houses go by, wide-eyed and pale. It seemed to Reggie Fortune that she was not thinking, but in the grip of fear. Sedate and smooth the car ran on, and not for the first time. Reggie fretted at the majestic caution of his chauffeur. When they turned from the noisy racing of the Brighton Road into winding lanes, it became still more impressive. The shade of the forest received them. The heavy sense of it came into the car. They were climbing the hill to Langton's house when a shot rang out. Mrs. Harford gave a little cry and clasped her restless hands. Bell turned in his seat. Reggie made a furious gesture. Bell spoke to the chauffeur, and the big car surged over the hill. Another shot was fired. They came to Langton's gate, and with a symphony on the horn the car swung in. Reggie Fortune saw Langton's face peer from a window in his laboratory and made ready to jump out, then sank back again with a sigh of relief. Across the garden came Wilfrid Harford. Mrs. Harford was out of the car and running to him. "Oh, Wilfrid," she cried, "are you really all right?" He jerked himself away from her. "Oh, don't fuss so." His eyelids twitched and he shook. "Whatever have you come for?" Reggie Fortune slid to the ground in one silent movement and stood watchful. "Wilfrid." "Oh, don't look at me like that, dear. It frightens me. I had to come. I can't bear your being alone here. I want to be alone." The boy snapped. "Good heavens, don't you know that yet? You'd better leave me alone." The door of the house opened. The large form of Ingram Langton appeared. He looked keenly at the car and the solemn chauffeur and the stolid superintendent. Reggie Fortune was hidden from him by the body. "But I can't leave you alone, my dear," Mrs. Harford was pleading. "Oh, Wilfrid, it isn't good for you to be here." "I'm sure it isn't. I want you to come away with me." "With you?" the boy snarled. "Oh, go away, for heaven's sake, go away." He could hardly speak plainly. "Wilfrid, I do so want to have you with me. I came to take you away. You know this place is bad for you. I want you to come right away with me." "That's it, is it?" he mumbled. His hand was in his pocket. "Yes, I've seen a doctor this morning. He says I must take you away at once. Come with me, dear, and we'll go right away. Just you and me. I can't do without you, Wilfrid." She smiled piteously. "I must get you away from these people." She put her hands on him, yearned towards him. The boy flung himself back, plucking at his pocket. He had a revolver out as Reggie reached him and struck his arm aside. But a shot was fired, and his mother reeled and fell. Langton rushed out and grappled with the boy, who should have been helpless in the big man's grip. But they swayed together, and there was another shot as Reggie caught the thin wrist, and Bell tore the revolver away. "Stand off, you!" Bell's other hand took Langton by the throat. Wilfred Harford staggered away from them towards his mother. His face was red with his own blood. Reggie held him up. "Look what you've done, sir," Reggie said quietly. Mrs. Harford, one hand on her breast, raised herself. "Oh, he didn't, Mr. Fortune," she said faintly. "It was me. I was holding him when he was playing with it. I made it go off. It's all my fault." "Yes, that's your mother, sir," Reggie smiled at the boy. Wilfred cried out and tried to break from his arm, stumbled and fell. Reggie swung on his heel. "Take charge of Langton, Bell. He's not to leave the house. He can send for anyone he likes." "Who the devil are you, sir?" Langton cried. "I'm Reginald Fortune." "And I'm Superintendent Bell of the CID. Come on," said Bell. "Here, Sam," Reggie called to his chauffeur. "Get some water and clean linen out of that house." He bent over the woman. "Oh, not me," she panted. "Wilfred's hurt." But the quick light lingers were busy at her breast. "I'm thinking of him," said Reggie gently. And in a little while mother and son were laid in the big car and driven away. It was evening when the car hooted at the gate again, and a frightened servant opened the door to Mr. Fortune. Bell sat in the hall by a window. "Langton telephoned for Geoffrey Harford," he said in a low voice. "He came quick. They're in there. Lot of talking." Reggie flung open the door of the library. Langton sat in a heap. Over him stood a little sallow man, whose face was loose skin in a multitude of wrinkles, the darker for his white hair. "Yes, I thought I should find you together," said Reggie sharply. He looked about him. "Yes, this is the room where you worked on the boy when you had him drugged. Pleasant memories about it, Mr. Harford." "I have not the pleasure of your acquaintance," Geoffrey Harford said primly, but his brown eyes glowed. "Remember that voice, Bell?" said Reggie over his shoulder. "Mr. Langton can introduce me." Langton pulled himself together and stood up. "It's Reginald Fortune, the Scotland Yard surgeon," he said. "I told you. He brought Mrs. Harford down." "That was so unwise, Mr. Fortune," Geoffrey Harford said gently. "You've made yourself responsible for a very unfortunate affair." "Yes, I was sure you'd regret it," Reggie smiled. "It hasn't gone according to plan." "No, indeed." Geoffrey Harford's voice was softer still. "How is my poor cousin?" "Which of them?" said Reggie. "I think first of Muriel, but indeed." "You always have, haven't you?" said Reggie Fortune, and paused a moment, looking from one man to the other. Langton wiped his lips. The sunken eyes of Geoffrey Harford burnt. "Mrs. Harford's wound is not serious. I have no doubt she will live." Geoffrey Harford turned his back on Mr. Fortune. Langton leaned on a chair. "What about the boy?" he said hoarsely. After he reached the hospital, Wilfred was still able to speak. He did speak. "As you say, a very unfortunate affair, Mr. Harford." Geoffrey Harford swung round. His placidity was shaken, his wrinkled face twisted and twitched, his voice rose high. "What do you mean by that tone?" "It's insolent, sir, and brutal. It's intolerable. You've meddled with a very sad case which Dr. Langton was treating, and caused a terrible tragedy. Now you have the impudence to threaten us." "With what?" Reggie said sharply. "I have no idea. Think it out. Some time ago, Mr. Langton brought here a lad suffering from bronchitis and asthma. He treated the boy with Gelsomine. He used such large doses that the boy's nerves and mind were affected. From time to time he stopped the drug, brought on the cough again, and produced the irritation which comes of craving for a drug. This was done when the mother was here, so that the boy should believe her presence made him worse. While he was under the influence of the drug, it was Mr. Geoffrey Harford's habit to practice hypnotic suggestion on him and introduce into his mind the idea that his mother was his enemy and that he could only obtain freedom by killing her. "This is a wild invention, sir," Geoffrey Harford cried. "You've been heard," Reggie said quietly. "We heard you at night. Perhaps Mr. Langton remembers a man who knocked him up to ask the way to the Brighton Road. You've been spying here? Yes. You interested me some time ago, Mr. Harford, and now we have the poor boy's evidence. I told you he was able to speak for a little while. Some days ago, Mr. Langton suggested to the boy that it would be amusing for him to practice revolver shooting. Mr. Langton kindly provided the revolver. You've got it, Belle. Good. And today, when his mother tried to persuade the boy to go away with her, he shot her and shot himself, which Mr. Langton, who was holding him and could break him in half, very cleverly allowed him to do. Yes, all very ingenious, but we've saved Mrs. Harford's life. He stopped, and in the silence heard Langton's breathing. What do you mean to do? Langton growled. I shall charge you with conspiracy to murder. Preposterous, Geoffrey Harford panted. Langton saved the boy's life. He jumped overboard in mid-channel and... I know. It was in all the papers. Very convenient to get that in the papers. Langton saved the boy at the risk of his own life. I'm sorry. For a moment, Reggie Fortune looked with some sympathy at the broken man. Langton turned away with an oath. But it wouldn't have done for Wilfred to die before his mother. Then the family estate would have gone to her. You thought of everything, didn't you, Mr. Harford? She had to die first so that her money came to him. And that's just what didn't happen. If only he'd killed her before he killed himself, you'd have got everything. Yes, a near thing. It's a lie, Geoffrey Harford screamed. The devil take you, it's a lie. I didn't want her foul money. I wanted her brat to kill her. Oh, heaven, don't talk, Langton groaned. We've had enough talk. What are you going to do with us, Fortune? Belle will telephone for the local police. They'll take you away. And Superintendent Bell went out to the telephone in the hall. But Geoffrey Harford, his wrinkled face still twitching, cried, "Cut. It wasn't her money, you fool. I didn't want her money." Langton laughed. Well, you won't get it, will you? I suppose we'd better get ready, Fortune. Yes, I don't know what they'll let you take. Langton opened an inner door. I shan't want much, he said as they went out. Mr. Fortune walked to the window and opened it. He was standing there when Superintendent Bell came back. Why, sir, where are they? Reggie did not turn. They've gone to get ready, he said. But you oughtn't to let 'em go alone, oughtn't I? Reggie murmured. Where did they go, sir? This way. Bell opened the inner door. It gave upon a passage which led him to Ingram Langton's laboratory. This won't do, you know, he began. Then his voice went up. Mr. Fortune! Reggie followed him. It was very light in the laboratory, amid the shining white tiles and the shining glass. Geoffrey Harford sat at a table where a microscope stood by some porcelain dishes. Langton lay on the ground. Bell was kneeling beside him. My heavens, he's cold already, he gasped. Cold and damp. Reggie looked into Geoffrey Warlord's face. The thin lips were blue. Reggie sniffed. In the faint mingled odours of the laboratory, there was a scent of bitter almonds. He took up a beaker from the bench above Langton's body. One of the cyanides, or hydrocyanic acid itself. He smelt it gingerly and wandered about looking at the bottles of reagents and drugs. Yes, tidy fellow. He put the bottle back. But you see, it's just been moved. Very neat he was. Bell looked at Langton's livid face and shuddered. Oh, Mr. Fortune, you shouldn't have let him go. Reggie shook his head. The best way, Bell, the best way. Best? Best for them, maybe. Bell rose heavily. It was our job to bring them to trial. They've gone to trial, Reggie said. Bell gulped. Yes, sir, but we've got a trial on hand here. What are we going to say at the inquest? I'm going to say that I came here to ask Langton to explain his suspicious treatment of a private patient of his. I found him with Harford. He didn't explain. When I spoke of calling the police, he took Harford out of the room to confer together, and they didn't come back. Verdict, suicide. The verdict's all right, Bell agreed, but it's a bad business. No, I don't think so. We shouldn't have been able to hang them. Why not? Bell stared. Why not, Mr. Fortune? They hadn't killed anybody. Good heavens, sir. Do you mean the boy's not dead? No, he's not dead. I hope he's not going to die. But you made him think he was. Yes, I made them think so, Reggie said gravely. They tortured that boy and his mother. They planned to murder mother and son. They did their best to murder the boy's soul. And the law would only have given them a few years in prison. I want justice. Bell looked at him with dread. It's an awful responsibility to take. Yes, I take it, Reggie Fortune said. He turned away and walked back to the library, sank into a chair, and lit a cigar and drew long draughts of smoke. Bell still watched him nervously. Mr. Fortune, did you notice the old fellow said he didn't do it for money? Yes. Yes. I wasn't surprised. I asked her in hospital if Geoffrey had any grudge against her. She didn't know. He'd never done anything. But he wanted to marry her when she was a girl and she wouldn't have him, and took his cousin instead. While the late Colonel Harford was alive, I don't think people had much chance of hurting his wife. When she was left with only this boy, Geoffrey thought he could make her suffer, poison her son body and soul, let her see her son kill her, something rather rich in revenges, Bell. The man was a fiend. Yes, he liked hurting, and he had ideas about it, not a nice fellow to have loose in the world. I suppose Langton went into it for the money? Yes, they must have worked it out together. But it was Geoffrey's scheme. I suppose he put it to Langton there was a fortune going, and Langton fell for it. I've rather wondered about Langton. He did decent things in his time. I fancy Geoffrey was a bad influence long ago. Poisoned his mind. He never got anywhere. He wouldn't do the grind. He grabbed at other men's work. A mean strain in Langton. He was greedy, just the sort of clever fellow to sell himself to the devil. A weird case, sir. Yes, we've hanged the murderers without a murder. That's quite unusual. Very distressing for the department. End of The Only Son by H.C. Bailey.